So good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a minute or two as more people filter in, and then we'll get started. Just a welcome again to everyone. Feel free to take a stretch or get a cup of tea quickly while we're just waiting for a couple of more people to join us, and then I'll kick things off. Do feel free, if you want to, while you're waiting, to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you want to say who you are and where you're joining us from, that would be great. Okay, I think we'll make a start as we're just after 12. So very warm welcome to all of you. Really great to be providing another Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network Early Career Researcher Lunchtime seminar. So we've got a whole series of these, and this is our latest one, which is about meeting the publisher. So we're very privileged today to have several people involved in different aspects of academic publishing to share their key insights with you. We're going to have 3 speakers. We'll take each one in turn. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions that you might want to ask. And what I'd ask you to do is just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you want to add some questions as we're going along, and I'll come at the end and look at those and ask them to our panel. Great, so just do that. Also keep an eye on the chat. Feel free to introduce yourselves if you'd like to in the chat and say where you're from, but also feel free to tweet as well. Great, lovely to see people doing that, fabulous. All right, so let's kick off with our first speaker. So he is Dr. George Bousden, who's a division editor for Behavioural and Social Sciences, Neuroscience and Mental Health team at PLOS ONE. And he has a background in psychology and neuroscience, specialising, interestingly, quite different to many of us, in the use of rodents to better understand human disease. And he took his PhD and postdoc at the University of Cambridge, and I think he's in very sunny Cambridge today. So he's very passionate about open science, reproducibility, and preventing publication bias. And therefore, perhaps it's not surprising that he's going to talk to us today about the benefits of registered reports. So I'll pass over to George. Thanks, George.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that introduction. So yeah, as Helen mentioned, today I'll be talking about the benefits of registered reports. And I work for PLOS. So in case you're not familiar with PLOS, so PLOS is a non-profit open access publisher, and we publish 12 journals in total. Specifically, I work for the journal PLOS ONE, and that's a journal that considers research in all areas pretty much across science and medicine. And we evaluate submitted manuscripts on the basis of methodological rigor and high ethical standards, and we do that evaluation regardless of novelty. So I think that lends quite well to registered reports in many ways that I'll be talking about today. So I wanted to start off with a bit of a discussion as an overview of what a registered report is. Some of you may be familiar with this format already, but for those of you who aren't, I'll just provide a brief overview of how this differs from the standard way that we normally publish our research. I then want to spend a bit of time talking about what the benefits are, and I'll start off by talking about what the benefits are to the community and the wider group. But also I think that one of the really important parts of registered reports is the benefits to you as an author. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about that as well. So let's start off talking about, well, what is a registered report? So it's essentially a new way of submitting your research to a journal. So in this case, the plan for research is submitted to a journal before data collection. So it's essentially pretty much your introduction and methods, and you may include some expected results as well. And that proposal that you've put forward is reviewed by the journal, and it will go through a standard peer review process. So it will go out to peer review, and hopefully, if the peer reviewers are happy with what you've proposed, you'll receive an acceptance in principle. So what that means is that provided you perform those experiments as you've outlined in that protocol, the journal will then publish those results regardless of outcome. And this is a format that's offered by around 250 journals, and PLOS One is one of those, and PLOS Biology also publish them as well. So just to go over that again, I'm just going to talk through this flowchart at the bottom here. So we've got the research process. So the first few stages of the research process are you're developing that idea and you're designing that study. And of course, with a normal research article, you would then continue to go and get your data. But with the registered report, once you've developed that idea, designed that study, you then go ahead and submit that proposal to the journal. That journal peer reviews it, and as I'll be talking about later, sometimes they might suggest tweaks to that experimental design, and I'll be talking about why I think that's a really useful thing. In some cases, and PLOS One does publish these, there is an opportunity to have that protocol published, so you can tell the world immediately what you're up to. Then once you've had that agreement in principle to publish your research, then you go ahead and collect your data, you write your report, and then it goes through a peer review process again. We would normally expect that peer review process to be a bit lighter and a bit more straightforward because, of course, the peer reviewers have already had opportunity to really critically assess that manuscript. And as long as you perform those experiments as you initially outlined, then you should receive that acceptance in principle. You should have received that acceptance in principle. So therefore, when you have the research article, that's ultimately published. So that's how registered reports work. What are the benefits then? So I'll start off talking about what I see as really the key benefit to registered reports. And I think this is something that's really beneficial for the community. The main reason they were launched is to try and mitigate the effects of publication bias. So I think there are two main ways that publication bias can come around. One is this file drawer situation. So often you may come up with this fantastic idea and you've got this really novel hypothesis that you think, oh, it'd just be fantastic and so novel if I can prove that this is true. So you have this really interesting hypothesis, you go and collect your data, and unfortunately it doesn't quite come out how you'd wanted it to. And often what can happen is the end result of that is that you don't publish it. You know, you thought you were going to have this really exciting story to tell the world, and unfortunately it doesn't quite work out. And this is really problematic because it means that the published corpus isn't an accurate representation of what's actually happening in the lab. So that is a concern, and that means if you're reading the literature, you don't have a good idea of what's actually happening in the real world, so it isn't terribly helpful. Another potential way that publication can arise is through the actions of journals. I think we're aware that journals often like to publish novel and really interesting results. And that means that if your really interesting hypothesis wasn't proven, then a journal may be a bit more reluctant to publish your results. And again, that causes this problem because you have this difference between what's happening in the lab and what's happening in the published corpus as well. So that's sort of the theory. So now registered reports have been around for a while. We're starting to see some sort of evidence that this is actually the case, which I think is really interesting. So I think this is a really striking graph on the right. And what this is showing is how often the first hypothesis is supported in a standard report and how often that first hypothesis is supported in a registered report. And you can see there's this really remarkable difference there, whereby standard reports are much likely to have that hypothesis reported versus registered reports. And one of the main reasons for that, I think, is because of publication bias. There are other reasons that maybe we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. There are things like harking. I don't know whether you've heard of this. So this is where you hypothesize after results are known. And so that means that you collect your data and then you make your hypothesis, which is obviously completely backwards. But the standard reports do allow that to happen. Obviously, it's not encouraged, but it is possible. With a registered report, you have a pre-registered hypothesis, so there's absolutely no possibility of doing that. Some further evidence to support the benefits of registered reports. It's been shown that effect sizes are much smaller in registered reports versus standard submissions. So an effect size of 0.36 versus 0.16. And my view is that the registered reports are giving a much truer account of what's actually happening in the labs and in your experimental studies. And I think that, you know, if you're doing meta-analyses or anything like that, it's really important that you do have an accurate representation of that. So I think that registered reports are really important in that respect. So those are the benefits to the community, but I think that there still needs to be some benefits to yourself. You know, the academic world is a very difficult one. It's very competitive. So I think we can't just do things for the community. Sometimes we need a benefit for ourselves as well. And I think there are two key ways that I really want to talk about in that why I think registered reports are beneficial for you as researchers and authors. So one of those is early feedback. So of course, the way that the registered report process works is that before you've actually conducted your study, you can get feedback on your experimental design. And this is really valuable. You may have been through the peer review process already, and you may have had an experience where you've collected your data and the reviewer has said your control isn't suitable. There's a potential confounding factors that you haven't considered. And this is a really difficult situation to manage once you've already collected those data. You've already ran it with that control condition. Maybe you'll have to go back to the lab and collect more data. Maybe you'll just have to argue with the reviewer, or maybe ultimately your manuscript will get rejected because of this potential concern. Now, if you're doing a registered report, you're not going to have that problem because the reviewers have an opportunity to raise those concerns before you've collected those data. And to illustrate this, I thought I looked through some registered report protocols that PLOS ONE has published, and I looked through the reviewer reports, and I thought that this was a really good example of the benefits to you as a researcher of submitting a registered report. Before I go any further, I will just mention, so normally you might be a bit surprised that I'm using reviewer reports here, and often the peer review process is confidential. At PLOS ONE, we do have an opportunity to publish the peer review history. So that's a choice that's made by the authors. And in this case, the authors have chosen to publish that peer review history. So I'm able to share these reviewer comments with you, and you're more than welcome to look at them on the website as well. So in this particular instance then, so the reviewer said that looking towards the target after the first prompt is not strong evidence that they have not associated the word with the target. A better test would be to use a completely novel word in test. Now, I appreciate obviously you haven't looked at this manuscript, so that might not be entirely meaningful to you. But what the point I really want to get across here is that this reviewer is providing feedback on the author's experimental design, and they're suggesting that they change it in a particular way. So now we can look at the author's response to these concerns. And what they say is, based on reviewer one's suggestion, we redesigned the follow-up control condition. So I think this is a real, I think this is clearly such a beneficial experience for the authors because they've had that early feedback. As I said earlier, it's so much easier to address these things and make minor tweaks to your experimental design before you've collected those data. In some cases, of course, the reviewers will be absolutely satisfied with your experimental design, and that's great. And again, you know that when you're coming to submit after you've had that acceptance in principle, you know when you come to submit your full research article that you don't need to worry about the reviewers raising concerns about controls or sample sizes or anything like that. One of the other benefits that I want to talk about to you as a researcher is having early credit. So as I mentioned, at PLOS ONE, we do publish the registered report protocol that you've submitted. And I think this is a really important step to gain credit for those early stages of that research process. So coming up with an idea and so on, that's just an important part of the research process is actually collecting the data. And being able to publish that protocol means that you get credit for that, and you also get early credit for it. Some of the registered reports that we get are going to take 2+ years to collect the data, and then add additional time on to actually write the report. By publishing a registered report protocol, you mean you're getting credit for that idea much earlier than you would otherwise done. And you're also telling the world what you're doing, basically. And I think that can act as scoop protection, because you've got published evidence that you had this idea and you were working on it. And you can see I've shared some of the article level metrics for this protocol that we published just under a year ago. And you can see that it's been viewed almost 5,000 times. It's been cited and it's been shared and saved as well. So that's mainly what I want to talk about, the key benefits. So we've talked about the benefits to the community in that it prevents publication bias. I've talked about the benefits to you. So one of those, I think the really key one, is this early feedback and this opportunity to get comments from reviewers before you go ahead and commit to that experimental design. And then I also think that there are benefits of early credit as well, and laying claim to that idea, and also telling the world what you're up to, and telling the community that this is a really interesting idea. And I think that means people will come to you when they're looking for the next steps of what's happening with that process. So that's all I had. Thanks so much. And I think we have a Q&A a bit later, so I'll look forward to having questions from you.
Fabulous. Thank you ever so much, George. Really helpful. And I think just a really burgeoning area of publishing and really pushing the boundaries of science, really, isn't it, in that broader open science framework. So really great to see that, and just really growing area. That's fantastic to see. So so people want to put questions to George in the Q&A. We'll come back to those after all three speakers have had their turn. Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'll pass now over to our second speaker, who is Dr. Mark Boyce, who joined The Lancet as a senior editor back in 2010 and is the founding editor of The Lancet Psychiatry, one of the foremost journals in mental health in the world at this point. He trained in medicine at Oxford University and subsequently on the psychiatry rotation at UCL. And he has a wide range of interests, including in suicide research, trauma, old age psychiatry, and social and transcultural aspects of mental health. And he's very kindly joined us today and is going to provide us with some really extremely valuable insights on how to get published, particularly in his journal and others. Fabulous. Thank you so much, Niall.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you, George, for that great insight into the registered reports process. Yes, my name is Niall Boyce. I'm the editor of Lancet Psychiatry, and today I'm just going to be taking you very briskly through the publishing process, really aiming to demystify it and to give you some hints and tips as to how you can make it work for you. Now, as editor of the Lancet Psychiatry, I see every single submission that comes in. And because I have so many submissions, I like to keep things very simple. So when I see a new paper, I ask two questions off the paper. The first question is it a good research question? And by this I mean, is it a question that is actually likely to change practice or to substantially change the way that we think about things? So that's the first question I ask. The second question is it answered in the best possible way? Now this is, if you like, two sub-questions. The first is, what type of study is it? So for instance, if you were to say, I'm going to send a paper in saying, what is the prevalence of diagnosis of personality disorder worldwide, which is, that's an area which is still very murky, I'd say, well, okay, that's a good research question to ask. But if you were to then say, I'm going to answer this question by doing a systematic review and meta-analysis, I might think that wasn't such a good way to answer it because by its nature, the data out there are not fantastic. So you might have to go and do your own sort of particular survey or whatever to get those data. So that's what I mean by, is it answered in the best possible way in terms of study type. Generate a good question and then choose the study type to answer it. Don't start off saying, this is the type of study I do, and look around for questions. That doesn't work quite so well that way. The second thing, subtype of, is it answered in the best possible way, is about the execution of the study. And really that relates to much of what George was talking about in terms of using the most rigorous possible method to answer the question which you've posed. Now, one way in which you can do this and do it in a way that will tend towards successful publication is to start off by looking at the guidelines for reporting of the particular type of study which you're doing. And I'm just going to pop in the chat two things, the first of which is a link to the Equator Network. Now, the Equator Network is where you can go to find the particular guidelines for your study. So if you are looking to do a trial, you can find the consort guidelines there and really the sort of checklist for the sorts of data which you need to be collecting. And it's a very good idea to incorporate those requirements into the design of your study right from the beginning. So do go to the Equator Network. It is full of all sorts of interesting and exciting acronyms, lots of guidelines, but it's a really useful site. Please go there as you're designing your study. The second thing is pre-registration. Now, at this point, pre-registering your study is a must for trials. I don't think that many serious journals will look at your trial if you haven't pre-registered it. And this is really all about transparency. It's about saying that when you do an intervention and it turns out that the intervention works, that you haven't been sort of messing around a bit and changing what you were looking for in order to get a positive result. So please pre-register your trials. It is free. There are various sites in which you can do it. It's very important to do it. For everything else, it is desirable. So if you have a meta, for instance, do look at the Prospero website. Think of pre-registering. It's all about transparency, because I think transparency is really the key word for research from this point and going forward. Make friends with your statistician. Please do that. Make friends with your statistician, because a lot of the problems which we get, which would lead us to reject a manuscript, which otherwise had asked a good question and had used a good method, would be because the statistics were really inadequately planned. And these are things which cannot be fixed at a later stage. So befriend your statistician. And then a plea from me, a very quick plea, please sort out authorship. Now, the second thing which I'm going to be sharing in the chat is a list to ICMJE, which is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And that's a list of guidelines as to what is an author. Now, there are all sorts of guidelines as to what's an author, all sorts of criteria here. The one which I'd really like to draw your attention to, though, is the one at the bottom of the screen, which is agreement to be accountable. Now, especially when you're at an early stage in your career and someone says, hey, do you want to put your name to this paper? You can think, well, that's great, because I'm gaining something from it. But you're not just gaining something from it, you're also giving something to it. And that something is your good name and your reputation. And there have been cases in the literature where papers are published, they're blockbusters, they look great, everyone wants to be associated with them. And then there's a serious problem, sometimes even malpractice involved in the paper, and people regret being so hasty in putting their names to the paper. So make sure you qualify for these criteria, but most of all, make sure you're happy to be held accountable. Okay, so to recap, you have got a good research question, you've chosen a good method to answer it, you've designed your study really well, perhaps with the help of a registered report, you've sorted out authorship, and now you need to choose a journal. Now, what some people do is they'll sort of look at impact factor tables and they'll say, okay, who's top of the impact factor charts? We'll aim for them, and then if they reject us, we'll just work our way down. That's a very inefficient way to do things, probably not the best way to do things. What I'd say is, revolutionary idea, read the journals. Look for any interest which particular journals have expressed in their editorials around your subject. If it's a Lancet journal, Lancet sometimes run commissions on things, which is a big expression of interest. So for instance, we've run commissions on psychological therapy trials and on institutionalization and deinstitutionalization of children. So things in those areas might be a hint we're interested. If you're compiling your reference list and you see the same journal turning up again and again, that might be the place for you. You should also ask around, see how quick a journal is with its turnaround time, because part of the rules are that you should only submit to one journal at a time. So make sure you submit to a journal which processes fairly quickly. We're very lucky at the Lancet Psychiatry, as we have full-time editors. We'll try to get a first decision to you within 24 to 48 hours. And then also look at your funder, because funders these days sometimes have requirements as to where you should publish, for instance, in open access journals. Okay, so you've selected your journal. Now you're going to submit it. Read the submission guidelines, please. Now, you don't need to format it with every sort of full stop and point as the journal would need, but you do need to look for the really important things. And mostly, I'd say, the really important thing is the context panel. So in BMJ, JAMA journals, Lancet journals, they all have some variation on the theme of a research and context panel. And the point of that panel is it says, why am I doing this research? Am I replicating what other people have done, or is there something new? And what does this actually add to the field? So that, I think, is the main thing to get in there. A concise covering letter saying why you think this is an important paper and why this particular journal. And with regard to that, beware of cut and paste. I sometimes receive covering letters saying, dear editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, which it won't make me reject a paper, but it does hurt my feelings. So please don't do that. And then also a very important thing these days is to consider preprint options. Preprints, for those of you who don't know, are a way to get the submitted version of your paper online before peer review, and to have the opportunity to have people look at this and comment on it. It's good for several reasons, one of which is, as I said earlier, transparency. Another one of which is that if you have something original, you can essentially sort of put your flag in it before the peer review process. And another reason is that people can comment and can leave you some useful feedback on your paper. Now, the Lancet has its own preprint server. When you upload to a Lancet journal, you have the option of putting the submission on the site as a preprint. But there are plenty of other places you can go. So there's medRxiv and SciArchive and various other places. So seriously, please consider preprints. So let's recap. You have a good idea. You've got a good method. You've done it robustly. You have chosen a journal well. You've written a nice, concise covering letter. You've sent it in, maybe with a preprint, and you get a rejection. Now, the rejection can happen at the point where the editor has seen it. That's a so-called desk reject, or it might have gone to peer review, which I know Helen will be talking about in a moment. Dealing with rejection is very difficult, but if you want a career in research and if you want a career in publishing, rejection is something you're going to have to learn to deal with. Rule 1, keep your temper. Please don't send intemperate, angry emails. That will make an unfortunate situation far worse. But if you are unclear as to why your paper was rejected, ask the editor. I'm always happy to answer these queries. And if you think the decision was wrong, if you read, for instance, the peer review, and you think this peer review has got the wrong end of the stick, they've mistook what I'm doing, then you might be able to appeal. Ask the editor about that. Appeals would normally need to do very well, but they can work. So do keep your options open. Okay, so let's say the same process has happened, but instead of a rejection, you get a revision letter. Now, I know it's really hard when you have spent months, years of your life preparing a piece of work, and you've sort of hauled it over the line, and then you get an email from me saying, I like this paper a lot, now I'd like you to change a lot of things about it. I know that's frustrating, but it is a really good sign, because if you've read between the lines of my presentation so far, you'll have figured out that there are lots of filters which you'll have gone through in the Lancet Psychiatry specifically, or any other high impact journals, to get to this point. If you're being asked to revise, that's a really good sign. It's a sign you've got through so many barriers and hurdles. So when you're asked to do this, make sure you address all the reviewer's points, not just in the response to reviewers document, but in the paper too. Please do that. If reviewers are pulling you in different directions, ask the editor for clarification. Make sure, as you're editing, that you keep a track changes version of your paper, because journals will tend to ask for that. Stay focused, try to be prompt, try to be comprehensive. Okay, so it's all gone well. You've got a good paper, you've got a good question, you've got a good method, you've chosen the journal correctly, it's gone to peer review, you've answered all your revision points, your paper has now been accepted. Now your problems begin, because medical literature and mental health literature in particular is way more in the public eye than it was 10 or 15 years ago. You need to look at what you've written, and you need to wonder if possibly you need a press release or any other sort of media communication. Now, the point of this is not to hype your work, it is to clarify your work, because as mental health researchers, you're dealing with issues which are of profound importance to people and are also profoundly sensitive. So think about how your paper can be best understood. Think about who you might ask to help you with that, your internal comms department, the Science Media Center, the journal's communications department, if they have one. And think about how your paper might be misread. Think about the pitfalls and misunderstandings which it might fall into. Now, one way to do this is to think about this, and then to not only have the paper, but also think about your social media strategy. How will you tweet about your paper in the most appropriate way? Maybe a blog for the general audience with a website like The Conversation, which is a really good website for academics to speak to the general public. So think about these strategies in advance. Avoid tweeting back in anger, avoid being drawn into arguments, and especially avoid being drawn into arguments for which you are not prepared. And again, please keep your temper. And of course, the journal will receive some correspondence on your paper. Be prepared to answer that, and be prepared to answer it with good grace. So here's a summary, really. Start with a focused question, and then identify the best method, and make publication planning part of your strategy from the very, very start. Remember the Equator Network, look for the reporting guidelines, incorporate those into your design. Target the journal that's the best fit, and you will have to move swiftly at times, but be prepared for a bit of a long haul, because it can be a long haul sometimes. And finally, be ready for public outreach, but remember that if your research is good, it needs no hype, and it will speak for itself. So that's all I have to say, and I'll now hand over to Helen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Niall. That was really comprehensive, and I think we've got a huge range of different things to think about, and really appreciate you taking us through that. Also, just to say, in response to your kind of last points, I've just put in the chat a link to one of these sessions that we did last year, where we did have people from the Conversational Science Media Centre talk about how to engage with them to promote research. I do just encourage everyone to look at that another time as well. Great. All right, thank you. So I will now pass on to myself, which is very exciting. And this is where I see if I can share my screen. See if my bit is going to work. Great. So I just want to spend a few minutes taking you through in a little bit more detail about the peer review process. Just from slightly different perspectives that I hold, at least, from editor, which Niall has covered a little bit already, peer reviewer and author. So we'll kind of do this fairly briefly, but hopefully it will be helpful for you. So just to explain a little bit first about my role in the publishing process and the different roles that I hold. So firstly, I'm what's called a specialist subject editor for psychosis in particular at one of the big journals in child and adolescent mental health, which is the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. That's a link here, which I'll put in the chat in a bit. And this is a journal published by Wiley. And as you know, lots of different publishers with lots of different formats and styles. And it's published on behalf of the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health in the UK. And it publishes on experimental longitudinal intervention studies, and is particularly focused on advancing our understanding of developmental psychopathology, to why children and young people develop mental health problems, with the idea that will hopefully inform theory and clinical practice particularly. And it publishes a range of different styles, and does accept papers that have been pre-printed, as Mark was mentioning earlier. So it does original research papers, does reviews as well, but those are also often commissioned, which is another approach to publishing, which we can come back to in the Q&A. So just to say, and I've covered this, but in the role I play as a special subject editor, is sitting above me, quite far above me is the editor-in-chief. So Niall would be the editor-in-chief in The Lancet Psychiatry. Edward Summer Barker is the editor-in-chief for JCPP. And so what he does, as Niall was explaining, is the editor-in-chief will scan through all papers that come in. So that's a huge job to make that decision. And as Niall was saying, really they'll think about, does it fit within the scope of the journal? Is it an important research question? And have they chosen the right study design and been executed appropriately? If it gets through that phase, it will then get assigned to a handling editor, such as myself. And my job really is to spend a lot more time reading through the covering letter, through the manuscript, any supporting material, and make, if you like, a second decision about whether, now that I have read it a bit more, and also I'm more of a specialist in this area, am I happy for it to go to review? So most of the time that's a yes, but not always. Sometimes I will bounce it back to the editor-in-chief and say, actually, I don't think this is going to do well in this process. I'd like to reject it outright. So assuming it goes to peer review, then my job, which is the painful job most of the time, is trying to find people to review it. So I have to assign people and kind of almost beg in a way sometimes to get people to review the paper for me. And I have to think, obviously, carefully that they're not conflicted, not in the same institution, or have published too recently, at least, with the other authors. So then I hopefully send it out to peer review, and eventually hopefully get, at least from my point of view, at least, and this does differ slightly by journal, I would want at least 2 different independent peer reviews back before I make a decision about whether I'm going to now reject it, ask for that revision, and then make a further decision, or accept it at that point. And that's unusual. Most of the time we would ask for further revisions. Okay, so that's one role that I hold, so one thing I do. I guess the other role that I hold is as a peer reviewer itself. So I review for quite a wide range of mental health journals, but also journals that specialise in violence, victimisation, and trauma. And that's both as what we might call an ad hoc reviewer, so people will email me if the paper comes in and they think it's in my area, and I to review for Lancet Psychiatry, but also some of the other psychiatric journals, as well as I say, things like child abuse and neglect. And then I also, there's another way of being a peer reviewer, and that's sometimes where you get put on something called a scientific advisory board, or another term that journals will use, where there's an expectation from the journal. You're named on the journal website, and often you're expected to review several papers a year as part of that, and sometimes feed into the remit of the journal itself. And then finally, as an author, and just thinking about the process that Niall described, I'm not quite sure how I've managed to publish over 180 papers already, but it's been very painful, every single one of them, I think, but very worthwhile. And obviously, inevitably, so most of those very early in my career were with me as first author, but the majority of those now as me as a middle author, or often as the senior author, so the person kind of supervising the first author to write a paper. So a variety of roles that I've held. So just to kind of take the different perspectives then about what I think in terms of peer review, and these will differ slightly between people, but this is just my thoughts about it. As I say, as an editor, handling editor, I certainly want to have at least 2 people independently review a manuscript for me, Many journals will expect more than that. Some journals need at least 5 or want quite a wide range of different opinions. You can also sometimes request within a journal, as an editor, I can request for a statistician or someone more specialized in some aspects, such as neuroimaging, for instance, to review it for me as well. And as I say, they need to be people who are not conflicted. The issue I have inevitably is that there is a lot of time pressure associated with this, and this, as is often the case, but not in the case as Niall was saying in his journal, but for the journal I work with, those people will do these roles on top of their normal day job. So trying to do things very quickly with very little time is always hard. So I normally get about 3 days between the manuscript. Having passed through the editor-in-chief and sent to me for handling, I get 3 days to select my reviewers. I often have to make frequent reminders to get, I get frequent reminders to select more reviewers. Most people will normally decline a review, particularly in current times and particularly busy points in the year, like summer when people are on holiday or Christmas is always problematic. And once if I've got people, then when I've got the reviews in, I get about 3 to 5 days to make a decision. So it's pretty tight. So anything you can do as an author to help me with that by providing suggestions where that's allowed, some journals don't allow that, is very useful. What I want from a peer review is ideally a very clear steer on what the merits and the weaknesses are of the paper, to make it much easier for me to make a quick but informed decision about whether to accept it or not. I'm much less interested, although I'm guilty of doing that myself, of very pedantic things like, oh, this wasn't quite spelled right, or there was a grammatical error here, or full stop missing, etc. That's less of interest to me as an editor. And as I said earlier, depending on the journal, there are lots of decision options I have once I've got the reviewer comments back. One that I use for this journal, particularly quite a lot, is reject after review, because I can only really accept a small handful of papers every year for the ones that I get. I have a quota and I can't really pass over that. So it becomes very difficult. So if there are flaws, I will often, major methodological flaws, I will often reject after review. I can also request minor or major revisions for various lengths of time. And I can choose whether or not to send it back to review. If it's quite an extensive revision, I would normally send it back to get an opinion. For something shorter, more minor, I will often make that decision myself. But again, very slightly by journal. This is, yeah, a very small number am I actually really allowed to accept. So we have to make a decision. Often it's a really good paper, but it just doesn't meet the kind of top 5% of high quality that I'm kind of allowed to accept for this particular journal. Okay, so in terms of being a peer reviewer, quickly then, this is often, for academics, there's often an unpaid part of what we do, but it is in essence an obligation as a researcher. We submit papers, we expect other people to review them. Kind of seems fair that we should review for them. We don't, whether you agree with that approach or not is another matter, but it's kind of how the system works at the moment. Some journals will pay you for review, and other, but most won't. So just kind of be conscious of that. I tend to think it's quite helpful when I'm deciding what to review and not to review, to pick papers that at least are related to my areas of interest. So I get a little bit of an insight into what's happening in the field. Also for, in a slightly selfish way, sometimes useful to agree to review for a journal you're thinking of submitting to in the future, so that you can get a bit of a sense of the style, the kind of things that they tend to send to review, and kind of get a sense of the bar of what they're looking at. It's quite helpful. Also, from a personal point of view, it's a very useful addition, particularly as an early career researcher, to your CV, and you can start to use it to show your growing international profile. particularly if you're getting much larger or journals from outside the UK asking you to review. So that can be really helpful. However, my caveats are, do agree sparingly. No, I wouldn't necessarily agree with me as a editor chief, but I get probably 4 or 5 requests a day to review papers, and I can't possibly do that, or it would be my full-time job unpaid. So I think sensibly about it. As an early career researcher, you might get less requests, but yeah, I would say probably not more than 1 a month is realistic, because it's on top of pretty much everything else you're doing. And you might, sometimes people use the rules of thumb, like maybe reviewing 1 paper for every paper you've submitted, perhaps. But yeah, just not too many of them. From an editor perspective, what's really helpful is if you can't do it, or it's a paper you think it's not really in my area, or I've got too many other things on, what's really helpful for us is if you could decline it quickly, and ideally suggest 1 or 2 alternative reviewers is really helpful. And actually, I increasingly encourage, particularly if I'm asking more senior people to review, to suggest earlier career researchers to give them that opportunity as well. In terms of doing the peer review, I would suggest often it will take me a good hour to read a paper properly and make a comprehensive set of comments. Can take longer, sometimes people would take less time, but useful to appreciate it's going to take a bit of time. Obviously, if you can, and really important, provide constructive and polite comments. And I think my kind of takeaway from this is, what would you want to see if someone was reviewing your paper? Think about how the language you're using, whether your comments are really constructive. If you've got a comment, I'm not sure about this, or there's an issue, can you make a suggestion as to what might be able to change, or at least an acknowledgement that you can't possibly change everything. And I just flag here, and we can put this in the chat, but there's a huge amount of stuff out there about training to be a peer reviewer if you're interested. And Wiley, from the journal I work with, do have a reviewer academy, and you can go on some free training if it's something you're interested in. Okay, so just very quickly, an example of what a peer review form might look like. So this is one where I've got agreement from someone to share this. So for me, really key things are when you're reviewing for a journal, read their instructions. Each journal is very slightly different. So do read what they're interested in you looking at. You'll then often get the opportunity, or you always get opportunity to make a recommendation. Do think carefully about it and make sure it aligns with the comments you're providing. If you in your comments say, oh, this is a really great paper, and then you've ticked requires major reworking or rejection, it's not going to align for the editor, at least to help with their decision. Then, and I won't hold this up for too long, but basically there is a space normally to make comments to the editor themselves, and that can be really helpful from an editor's perspective if you're able to kind of flag anything you're really concerned about but don't feel necessarily comfortable saying to authors. Try not to put too much here because it's unhelpful if we want to give feedback to authors, but sometimes if you've read a paper very recently that was similar, or you're very concerned about the ethics of something else around the paper, it can be useful to flag here. Or if you think it's amazing and think it's a really valuable addition. In your actual review, it's quite helpful to very briefly start with a summary of what the paper aimed to do. I wouldn't do that for too long because we kind of know that's the point of the manuscript, but it's useful just to reflect back what you thought was the main aim and to highlight the kind of key strengths and whether you think it's really pushing the field forward. And then it can be helpful, it's up to you really, but it's useful to provide the suggestions for improvements or issues that you have by section of the manuscript. So what do you think about the abstract, the introduction methods, etc. It can be quite helpful for helping someone else work through it. And so just to kind of finish on this, so from the author's perspective, and Niall's covered quite a lot of this, do celebrate if you get the opportunity to revise and resubmit. As Niall said, it's really hard to get to this point, so do enjoy that. As he also said, do take a deep breath before you look at the comments. There's always comments, suggestions for changes, and you won't always agree with them. So take a deep breath, come back when you feel a bit less defensive, and really try and address them as much as you can. You can rebut comments, you can disagree, but you need to do that in an evidence-based way, or very clearly explaining why you don't agree. I would always suggest you discuss comments and potential responses with senior authors or other co-authors, and get their feedback on draft response letter and revised manuscript. In your response letter, do paste in every single comment and provide really clear and detailed feedback to every point, explaining what you've changed, pasting in the section that you changed from the paper, just because often as a reviewer, if it comes back to them, they'll want to quickly look through the response letter to see what's happened. They won't want to keep referring back to the manuscript. We hope they do, but they won't always. So do make sure everything's in that response letter. Why you changed it, what's changed, and what the actual sentences or table that you've changed. And often you get a separate covering letter to the editor, and you thank them, obviously, for considering the manuscript and explain any big changes that you've made, any outstanding issues you might want advice on. So you might say, well, the reviewers wanted all of this, I can't possibly fit it in unless you're willing to increase the word count or something else, so you can explain the issues there. I've just added into the slides a kind of brief example response, which you're welcome to look at. Really just flagging it's useful to thank the reviewers at the beginning, make sure, as I say, pasting the comment in, then it's highlighting what your response is, and making sure, as I say, that you paste in anything that you've changed, so it's all in one place. Great, so I'll finish there. Just wanted to say thank you for listening to mine and all the other talks, but also thank you in advance because a lot of you will be peer reviewing yourself in the future. So thank you in advance for doing that. And I'll add these to the chat afterwards for some additional resources for you. Okay, so we've got just under 10 minutes left for questions because it took longer than I was meant to. So yeah, perfect. George and Niall have come on screen. So I will now have a look at the Q&A. Feel free to add stuff to the Q&A box if other people have got them, and we can work through them. Great. So just looking at the Q&A. The first question we had in, George, probably helpful for you, is around the kind of publishing fees. So obviously journals have different fees for publishing, open access, and a question, I guess, around the registered reports. Does your journal charge for that? How does that work?
Yes, so the very short answer is that yes, we do. So the publishing of the registered report protocol does incur a fee. It's significantly reduced than a standard research article charge, but for most cases there is a fee. So as I mentioned, so PLOS is a non-profit, and we never want fees to be a barrier to publication. You know, we're not out here to make money. Our goals around accelerating progress in science and medicine and so on. So we do have some fee waivers available. They're not available to everyone, and you'd have to apply for them, but there is something that we grant a very large number of. So depending on where you're based and various personal circumstances, we may be able to offer some partial or full assistance there. As an organization, PLOS is trying to move away from these APCs. So this publication fee is also called an APC, that's an article processing charge. We are trying to move away from those because, again, we recognize that researchers themselves may not have funds to publish. And then, as I mentioned, we never want that to be a barrier to publishing something open access. So we are working with more and more institutions for those. I'm just going to put a link in the chat that basically has a list of all the different institutions that have agreements with PLOS. And for many of those, that will mean that you will be able to publish without additional fees. Some of them it's a slightly reduced one and so on. So do have a look on there. If you find your list on there, you may just want to double check with your university, but it may be completely free for you.
Thanks, George. And I think, yeah, it's always a an issue with these things. I think, I don't know, Niall, if you know, I think for so I guess the registered reports is when you're kind of saying this is in advance, what I'm going to do, and you've got your pre-prints where you're saying this is the submitted version of the paper. My sense was that the pre-print stage tends to be free. Some of these various things. Is that true?
As a rule, I'd in fact be a bit wary if someone is charging you for a preprint, to put a preprint up. And beware of, this is a good point in general, which is beware of predatory publishers. And you will be able to find lists online, but be very careful. Check at least that the journal you're submitting to is on PubMed, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Now, certainly, even though I get a lot of requests to review, I get even more requests from predatory journals every day. So I think just, it's great. And there's a very specific question for you, George, around publishing protocols for economic evaluation in PLOS One. If you want to just...
So again, short answer is yes. So PLOS One pretty much publishes everything in every subject area, and economic evaluations are definitely something that we consider. We are actually in the very early stages developing a call for papers on this exact topic. So we have very, very early stages. It might not even launch this year. So yeah, it's definitely something that we're interested in receiving, and you can either submit as part of that call for papers or separately, and it's definitely in scope for PLOS One.
Thank you. And just while you're on, just a similar, another question a bit further down about are the registered reports only for experimental designs, or can they be used for qualitative designs or other types of designs as well?
Yeah, so the scope of a registered report is exactly the same scope as PLOS One. So we publish lots of qualitative research, and it definitely, I know my presentation was very much focused towards experimental design and so on, but we do consider qualitative research, and yeah, so long as you've outlined things like your analysis, who your participants are going to be, what sort of qualitative approach you're going to take with that and so on, then yeah, all the registered report needs to do is outline your methods section. Basically, it doesn't need to be experimental, and it can be a systematic review and anything that PLOS One publishes, which is pretty much anything in terms of the scope.
Great, thank you. And I wanted now a question about becoming a peer reviewer for a journal, and I guess linked to that about the importance of diversifying our peer reviewers, which I know is important for lots of psychology.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you can do, of course, is drop us a line, but one of the best things you can do is to publish your own research, in fact. Having said that, we have, as a journal, made efforts to diversify our reviewer pool. There are two specific programs I'll cover very quickly. The first is that we want to increase the diversity of our reviewer pool globally. So we have what's called our editorial development board, which is early and mid-career clinicians and researchers from low and middle income countries. We, from time to time, invite applications, and that is a whole program of essentially training and mentorship in peer reviewing, which we offer. The other thing which we have been working on for some years now is involving people with lived experience of mental health problems as peer reviewers. That scheme's been underway for a while. It's been very positive from our point of view, from the point of view of our authors, and also from the point of view of the reviewers.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, as you say, it's so important to reach out to different people. And I think something as editors for us also to really, bear in mind and think about that. But I think in terms of identifying peer reviewers, it really, I mean, often we'll search PubMed and other things for people who've published in areas. So yeah, the more that you've got out there, the more help it is. And I think also you can speak to, for ECR, speak to your more senior investigators and also encourage them to put you forward for peer review. As I say, they often get lots of requests, so it's useful to do that. And you can work with them on a peer review together.
Yeah, exactly. And in case there are any, a plea to senior investigators is to involve your early career researchers in peer review. And we are more than happy. We're delighted when we see these kinds of collaborations happening in peer review. So please do that.
Thank you very much. Someone just asking about, so I was saying I quite like in response to reviewer letters that people paste in the actual changes, because I think it's quite helpful to have them contained, and I think that's useful for reviewers when they're looking back. Is that something you like in your journals, or do you, are you not too bothered?
Yes, we do in the revision process ask for a response to reviewers letter, and that kind of point-by-point response is what we wanted. It makes life easier for everyone. But as a caveat, do that, but don't forget to make the changes in the paper.
Oh, yes, in both places. Absolutely, and as you say, often expect a track change version as well as a clean version. And you can read the guidance around the revision. Okay, also just coming to time, but another question here about people who are using data from existing studies, so often using data from existing cohort studies, and how best to perhaps pre-register those if you're doing secondary analysis. I don't know, George, if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, so that is something that we'll still consider in a registered report format. Obviously, it's slightly different because the data collection, in essence, has already taken place. But we do recognise that I think the registered reports are still a hugely beneficial process for secondary data collection. And I referred to a systematic review protocol that we published, and that's sort of a similar sort of process where the data are already there, they just haven't been fully analysed yet. So yeah, that is absolutely something that we consider. Obviously, the most important thing, and there is a certain element of trust, is that you mustn't have touched that data at all. So it's really important that you haven't started any analysis. And that's because there's always a possibility of sort of skewing your data analysis depending on what the results are. And that's one of the key things that we're trying to avoid with registered reports. So if you are using secondary data, obviously you can take a look at that data set and see how big it is and things like that. But it's really important that you haven't started any analysis at all when you're submitting that registered report protocol.
Brilliant, thank you. And just a final one about opinion pieces, which not all journals offer. And I just wondered, Niall, particularly for yours, is that something where people can pitch, or do you normally just decide and commission those yourself?
We get them in a variety of ways. Very often people just upload an opinion piece, and with the sort of increase in submissions we've had with the pandemic and so on, I do tend more and more to just tell people to upload things because otherwise, I think it can be a bit hard to keep track. So if you upload it, we'll read everything. Sometimes it might be that the opinion might work in a shorter format. Sometimes, for instance, a personal view can be turned into a comment, or a comment into a letter, but we'll help you through that. So just upload it. We'll read everything and we will get back to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that's a general message, isn't it, really? It's useful to just reach out if you're not sure as well. And do contact the editorial team if you want some additional advice if it's not clear from the guidance. Great. Just a final question there about ECRs reviewing. It can be helpful to review for certain for your CV, as I said in my talk, but at the same time you have to remember you've got lots of other competing demands in your time. So as I say, personally, I would say probably not reviewing more than once a month is realistic. Sometimes you might review less than that, you might not get asked that much anyway, but probably if you're starting to do a few a week, that's probably too many, particularly for sales. But for senior people too, we have lots of other things we need to do as well. So I think just that balance is important, but it can be helpful often if you review. Early on in my career, I reviewed a lot for Schizophrenia Bulletin, for instance. Again, not very often in the year, but a few times, and that actually meant that they eventually approached me and asked me to be on their advisory board, which is very helpful career-wise, for instance. So yeah, I think a little and often is useful. Okay, I'm conscious we're at time, just over, so just wanted to say a huge thank you to George and Niall for spending time with us today and sharing really, really useful insights on the publishing process. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming along and for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get too much time to deal with those, but hopefully it was helpful. I've put a link in the chat. We will put the recording slides, other links to different materials such as training academies and different blogs around these kind of processes on the website, on the Advanced Abuse Mental Health website. So do return there. Do look at also the other sessions that we've run and things that are forthcoming. Great. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Have a lovely rest of the day and good luck with your publishing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.